What was the food like in prison?
Everyone's gotta eat, even those who happen to find themselves behind bars. Hopefully, no one watching this has any experience with the meals served up in prison because, let's be honest, the subpar grub dished out by your local prison is anything but 5-star dining. With that said, here's a look at 100 years of prison food.
You see, the food in prison was inedible.
Sing Sing inmates ate fairly well, 1920s.
Released from Sing Sing prison today.
Unfortunately, when it comes to prisons, the United States happens to be one of the countries with the most well-known and notorious prisons on the planet, especially back in the early 20th century. Back in the 1920s, there were only a handful of prisons that were truly infamous, and few were as infamous as Sing Sing. The New York prison first opened its barred doors in the early 1800s, which, for those keeping score, even predates the American Civil War. Sing Sing was known for its harsh conditions and is also responsible for the phrase "up the river" when referring to going to prison. So basically, the prison's reputation is well established. But what exactly did the inmates of Sing Sing eat on a daily basis? The daily menu at Sing Sing was surprisingly diverse, consisting of a varied menu for every day of the week.
Oh, fine dining and baseball food!
As an example, for a Monday, here's what Sing Sing inmates could expect for breakfast: a plate of hash with a slice of bread and coffee. For lunch, the inmates would sink their teeth into a boiled leg of lamb and turnips, boiled potatoes, bread, and coffee. Finally, dinner was vegetable soup with crackers and tea. On a Tuesday, inmates had an impressive breakfast, lunch, and dinner: oatmeal, milk and sugar, a slice of bread, and coffee. Lunch was pork and beans, boiled potatoes, bread, and coffee. And for dinner, burger,
peas and carrots,
boiled potatoes, bread, and coffee. The rest of the week was surprisingly just as impressive. Prison is and was no vacation, but the inmates in 1920s Sing Sing were at least decently fed.
That is all you're gonna get.
More prison chow from the 1920s.
Chow time!
The Roaring '20s were definitely a fun-filled time. After all, this was the decade that introduced the world to jazz, the economy was booming, and the world first got a glimpse of Art Deco, while collectively taking a sigh of relief with the end of World War I. While the cuisine wasn't exactly what modern folks would consider standard, some of the dishes served up during the decade have stood the test of time, such as deviled eggs and stuffed mushrooms. Yes, for the most part, the folks living during the 1920s experienced some relatively good times. Well, that is, until the end of the decade when the Great Depression hit, and of course, if you happened to enjoy a few drinks, you were out of luck due to Prohibition. And of course, life wouldn't have been all fun and games if you were a prisoner. As we're all aware, prison life is anything but fun and games, especially back in the day.
Gruel omelets. Nothing but gruel.
However, the meals served up in most prisons in the U.S. at this time were not exactly the classic gruel mush, bread and water we've all heard about from popular media. An average prison meal, such as dinner, consisted of a serving of sausages, some cornbread, beans, and a cup of tea. This differed from state to state, but on average, it seems like the folks behind bars in the 20s at least got the benefits of a decent meal.
prison real bad.
The Great Depression, 1930s.
Depression food.
As mentioned earlier, the Great Depression was less than a pleasant way to close out the 20s, to put it mildly. The economic collapse affected the entire United States along with the rest of the globe. The U.S. in particular experienced a lack of jobs, an unprecedented unemployment rate, and other hardships that folks in the 20th century had never experienced. With all that in mind, it's no surprise to hear that the food situation during this period wasn't great. With the economy shattered, people had to take what they could get and make the most of what they ended up with. It wasn't unusual to see items like buttermilk replace regular milk due to its relative cheapness, and dishes such as dandelion salad and Johnny cakes, a type of flat cornbread, present on the dinner table during the Great Depression.
This is so depressing.
It's also worth mentioning that Spam and all its canned meat jelly chili-covered notoriousness made its debut during the late years of the Great Depression. So if food for the average law-abiding citizen was pretty bleak, it stands to reason that the prisoners were likely in for something just as bleak, if not far worse. It turns out that the average inmate within the prison system of the U.S. ate surprisingly well during the Great Depression. It wasn't unheard of in some state correctional facilities to see such dishes as vegetable soup, boiled potatoes, a cup of milk, and a cookie for dessert on the menu. On the bright side, while the Great Depression did last an unbearable 10 years, by the time 1939 rolled around, it was all smooth sailing from there. Oh, wait a second, another world war was breaking out.
When will this nightmare end?
The 1940s.
Food schmood. This is war.
The 1940s started out with a bang, literally. Yes, by the time the new decade started, World War II had already been raging for a year. Of course, it would be another year before the U.S. was attacked and would thereby officially enter the war. However, this did not mean everything was fine stateside. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression and life was not yet back to normal. Over in the prison world, which is obviously rather unsavory to begin with, life was hard. While it's true that by 1940, certain aspects of incarceration across the country became more physically and psychologically tolerable, prison life in the 40s was nonetheless brutal.
I don't belong here.
Not only was there a boom in the prison population across the nation during the 40s, there was a massive problem with overcrowding and food shortages because of this inmate population boom. However, during the decade, the rise of in-house prison bakeries and inmate cooks saw prisoners being responsible for preparing the food being served. In many prisons nationwide, the prison dinner menu would have dishes like spinach and bacon medley, a slice of bread, a small salad, and applesauce. Not exactly a mouth-watering, hearty meal by any stretch of the imagination, but with the factors of times at play, prisoners could have done a lot worse.
Are you gonna say grace now?
Alcatraz, Purée, Mongole, 1940s.
Who has to break into Alcatraz?
Absolutely not.
Back in the day, one of the most notorious prisons in the U.S. and perhaps even the world was Alcatraz. The foreboding structure in the San Francisco Bay has inspired countless movies, documentaries, and books, and has cemented itself in pop culture. While the infamous prison was constructed back in the mid-1800s as a military prison, Alcatraz eventually became a maximum security federal penitentiary for civilians by the 1930s. By 1963, the prison was permanently shut down and is now a tourist attraction.
Do I just commit a crime?
In between the 1930s to 1963, however, was the most notorious time for the famous prison, with the likes of Al Capone stopping by for 4 years in 1934 and the Birdman of Alcatraz making the prison his home in 1942. Now, of course, no one can ask the Birdman, real name Robert Stroud, what the food was like in the infamous prison, as the former Alcatraz inmate died in 1963. However, there is a dish that would have been known very well to Alcatraz inmates called Purée Mongole. Purée Mongole is a creamed split pea tomato soup. Rather fancy and almost fine dining for prison food, right? Well, baked croquettes and watermelon also happened to be on the menu during Birdman's stint. Lucky him. Some folks say you can still smell the ghostly remnants of Purée Mongole brewing in what's left of the Alcatraz kitchen.
You smell like prison.
The 1950s.
They don't serve any of this 1950s food anymore.
The 1950s was a decade of economic growth. Just about everybody has seen the movies and other media depicting the decade as a carefree, pleasant era, almost fairy tale-like for suburban middle-class America. That's not far from the truth, as the decade was both prosperous and relatively pleasant for most. Okay, there was a little matter called the Cold War, which was in full effect, and the threat of nuclear annihilation was always on the minds of 50s folks. Also, the Korean War and the fear of communism, but other than that, a pleasant decade. But that's what was happening to folks living their everyday lives. Over in a place like San Quentin State Prison, on the other hand, life was not so carefree and pleasant.
Prison can be a very unpleasant place.
The California prison was and is known to house some of the most dangerous criminals in the country and has been referenced in song, countless movies, books, and popular TV shows. With that being said, even the most hardened criminals have to eat. And while San Quentin was the last place inmates wanted to be, dinner time was surprisingly not that unpleasant. Prisoners would regularly enjoy such dishes as hearty beef stew, mixed vegetables, and orange juice. Not exactly the fancy, bordering on elegant meals inmates were served in Alcatraz, but there were likely no complaints.
Actually, I do have one small complaint.
I'm in prison!
First time here? Then go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks.
Well, back to jail.
More from the 50s.
Okay, we're still on that.
Aside from the picket fence suburban pleasantness, the decade was also one of ingenuity, particularly when it came to space. The space race was off and running by the mid-50s and would be responsible for the eventual Apollo moon missions, advances in space technology, and Tang. While on the subject of food and bringing it back to Earth, so to speak, the 1950s was a decade full of culinary creativity and firsts. As we said, the orange substance beverage known as Tang kept our astronauts hydrated while on those lengthy space missions. Swanson introduced the first TV or frozen dinner, which was a cheap and convenient full-course meal for those who simply didn't feel like making dinner from scratch.
Well, I sure don't feel like cooking.
However, if we take a trip away from the 1950s suburbia and the metropolitan areas and venture over to the correctional facilities of the time, there were a few food innovations that really changed up prison dinner time. The innovation in question was the prison system's introduction of commissary service, which gave inmates who happened to have a little cash the option to buy chips and other snacks that were definitely not on the prison menu. Stepping away from the US over to the UK, prison life was pretty similar to what you'd find in your average American correctional facility, and the food dished out was average British items such as sausages, roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and roasted potatoes. Sounds pretty much like what you'd find on the dinner table outside of prison.
This is the Jonestown of dinners.
I feel like I'm in jail.
The 1960s.
Like a 1960s British policeman.
What hasn't been said about the 60s? The decade that brought the world flower power, psychedelia, lava lamps, hippies, and Woodstock is one of those decades that instantly brings trippy nostalgia to mind. For all those folks who didn't experience it firsthand, there have been countless movies, references, and even fashion comebacks inspired by the 60s. So it's safe to say you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who isn't familiar with the groovy decade. However, it wasn't all smiles and sunshine during the 60s, as events such as the civil rights unrest, the U.S. entering the Vietnam War, and the countless anti-war protests that followed were not exactly a great example of the peace and love message the decade is known for.
With peace and love, it's not working.
And life for your average convict in any of the numerous prisons across the country was less about peace and love and more about steel and stone. However, if we take a look at what was being served in prison for lunch, it likely put a smile on even the most somber inmate's face. A typical lunch for a model 1960s prisoner consisted of a tuna salad sandwich, pea soup, salad, pudding, and, of course, milk, because good bone health is important. Whether the vibe was 100% groovy in prison even after a relatively fantastic lunch like that is up for debate.
Have fun in prison!
The 1970s.
Flash forward to the 1970s.
The same decade that introduced the world to disco and the anti-establishment music revolution punk, the 70s were also responsible for some interesting food innovations. Some good and others most would like to forget. Dishes like Scotch eggs, pineapple on everything, and bomb Alaska, basically a baked Alaska on fire, are just as synonymous with the disco decade as, well, disco. Other dishes that were introduced in the 70s have actually stood the test of time, like the rich and delicious Black Forest cake. However, that's the free world. Life inside one of the many correctional facilities scattered across the U.S. is another story. While life in prison is known to be harsh regardless of what era you happen to be in, there are certain things like food that can make the environment a little more palatable.
That prison was like a prison to me.
As we've seen in many of the prisons in the past, the meals served can sometimes be a surprising treat. In the 70s, however, prison meals seemed to become a bit on the bland side. For example, a prisoner incarcerated in the 70s could expect a bowl of pasta, a boiled egg, and a slice of bread for dinner. Not as appetizing as a meal dished out back in the 40s era Alcatraz, but it's hard to go wrong with pasta. On the bright side, many inmates could look forward to a tasty dessert, which was usually a slice of cake. No word on whether that slice of cake was Black Forest, as it was the 70s after all.
There's a cake. I'll go get the cake.
More from the 70s.
Oh, we're still on course.
If there's one thing people who are afflicted with diabetes can tell you, it's that diet is extremely important. Your choice of food when you're diabetic can mean the difference between gaining an unimaginable amount of weight and many other health problems, and feeling relatively fine and full of energy. The same can be said about folks with dietary restrictions caused by religious practices. Folks of the Jewish faith, for example, can only eat meals that are kosher, while devout Muslims must only eat halal meals. This obviously applies to anyone who happens to be in prison. After all, being incarcerated doesn't somehow take away your diabetes or dietary needs. Unfortunately for inmates in previous years, if you had dietary restrictions, you simply had to make do with what was served. This, of course, meant that if you were suffering from diabetes in prison, the food wasn't going to help the problem.
Diabetes? Yuck.
Fortunately, by the time the 70s rolled around, prisons had changed their meal system to accommodate those prisoners with the aforementioned dietary restrictions. Fresh fruit and vegetables, as well as other meals for inmates with specific dietary requirements, were now on the menus of many correctional facilities around the country. On the other hand, many diabetic inmates likely were less than pleased with having to stick to their diabetic meals while in prison, with dishes such as ham and banana hollandaise and cheese and pineapple sticks being on some prison menus.
What's on the menu today, good sir?
The 1980s.
And in keeping with the wonderful 1980s,
it's debatable whether the 80s was the most iconic decade of all time. However, as many who lived through the decade will tell you, there definitely was almost too much going on during that time to be contained in just 10 years. With the rise of artists like Madonna, Michael Jackson, George Michael, and Boy George all in the same era, along with other pop culture icons such as RoboCop, Rambo, and Marty McFly, the 80s contributed a lot to pop culture. Over in the culinary world, the 80s didn't really pump out anything too memorable as far as new dishes go. However, snacks and classic junk food are another matter. The decade was responsible for pudding pies, New Coke, bagel bites, and Ecto Cooler, so it's safe to say that there was a lot of variety. Unfortunately, if you were a prisoner during the 80s, not so much. First off, life behind bars in the 80s was cramped and crowded.
Well, I can't really eat here.
Due to a population explosion, prisons across the U.S. were getting to the point of standing room only. This was unfortunate because even though the inmate population was becoming staggeringly high, there was no change in prison budgets. However, many of the prisons put inmates in charge of the kitchen as cooks, which helped save money. When it came to good old-fashioned prison cooking, the decade wasn't a good time for any inmate looking for variety in their diet. In many cases, prisoners were served the same meals every day as a cost-cutting measure. On any given day of the week, prisoners across the country could expect meals like grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, assorted fruit, and various snacks such as chips. Chips and snacks became particularly popular as part of a prisoner's diet during the 80s because many prisoners simply didn't like what was on the menu.
We'll probably have chips for dinner.
The 1990s.
Don't have to worry about your meals.
The 90s were relatively tame when compared to the all-night substance-fueled house party that was the 1980s. However, the decade that brought us Saved by the Bell and Nirvana is not without its charm. The 90s kicked off with the Cold War officially coming to an end, and a little song called Smells Like Teen Spirit launching grunge and alternative music into the mainstream. The U.S. economy was strong, and the Gulf War came and went. Overall, the decade was pretty chill. The average refrigerator would have held things like pizza rolls and pizza bagels, while in the cupboards, SpaghettiOs would have been waiting to be served. Prisons prisons in the 90s saw more overcrowding. This was, in part, due to the continuing war on drugs that saw prison populations nationwide continue to rise.
But then everyone started doing drugs.
When it came to the prison menus, inmates were served things like ramen noodles for dinner. For breakfast, a plate of scrambled eggs and a slice of bread. But is any meal truly complete without a dessert? Luckily for 90s prisoners, they had a nice frosty bowl of ice cream to look forward to. The decade was responsible for prisoners becoming pretty creative, however, with the meals they were being served. Many dissatisfied inmates would simply purchase food from the commissary and create their own dishes, with some surprisingly tasty-sounding results and others not so much.
Just shut up and eat.
Nutraloaf and the 2000s.
That would be our daily helping of Nutraloaf.
Anyone old enough to remember will recall that the year 2000 was rung in with a bit of fear and trepidation. There was a little thing called Y2K that had some folks scared to leave their homes. Y2K was supposed to be the end of modern civilization, with planes falling out of the sky and computer systems failing, all because of a programming shortcut. Of course, that didn't happen. However, the 2000s was the decade that gave the world Kanye West, Paris Hilton, and the phenomenon of celebrity socialites, and the introduction of the big blockbuster superhero genre. And where would the 2000s be without some of the most iconic food to come out of the decade?
Maybe I can skip this year.
Unicorn cake, cold brew coffee, avocado toast, and gluten-free products all became huge during the 2000s. Of course, if you were in the unenviable position of being incarcerated during that time, you had bigger things to worry about. Which brings us to Nutraloaf. Yes, that disgusting lump of brownish-gray food you've seen or heard about in pretty much every prison movie or series is a real thing. Nutraloaf consists of a medley of ingredients like meat, usually ground beef, vegetables, and other fixings like beans, and served purely for the purposes of nutrition and nothing more. However, the loaf has a notorious history of being dished out as a punishment. There have been several lawsuits involving Nutraloaf, stating that serving the meal constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The horror stories of Nutraloaf and its culinary cousin gruel have likely caused many inmates to suddenly lose their appetites.
What's for dessert? Gruel?
Before we look at prison food today, let's take a look at how prisoners are becoming their own chefs with some inmate food inventions. While prison may kill a person's spirit, it seems to invoke creativity when it comes to dinner time. In fact, many inmates across the country have created their own specialty meals with the use of snacks and other ingredients when the standard prison chow isn't cutting it. One example is the Menudo kit. Remember cup of soup? Well, in prison, the Menudo kit is kind of the same idea. If an inmate can get his hands on some chicharrones or pork rinds and a bag of pretzels, all that's needed is a can of easy cheese and 2 cups of water for a savory pork soup in a bag. Just think of the pretzels as crushed crackers. Another is strawberry vanilla cake. But how can you make a nice slice of rich strawberry vanilla cake in jail?
Unfortunately, we're surrounded by stupid law-abiding citizens.
Well, some ingenious inmate decided to use a pack of vanilla wafers, 1 bag of Berry's Bunch of Crunch cereal, 7-Up, strawberry drink mix, a few packs of vanilla shake mix, and 1 cup of powdered milk to create a DIY cake batter. Simply microwave and serve. The strawberry drink mix and vanilla shake mix are to be used for frosting. They thought of everything. Now, a look at what's being served in prison today.
Should I go to jail?
The 2020s.
I think you skipped a decade.
We've experienced what the average meal was like throughout the decades, but what about nowadays? Life outside of prison at the beginning of the 2020s was flat out miserable. A global pandemic had most of the citizens of the world confined to their homes. Not exactly prison when you're in the comfort of your home, but most people around the world who experienced lockdowns from 2020 to 2021 felt like it was the closest thing to prison. Fortunately, the food cooked up in the kitchen of your house prison was likely much more palatable than anything dished out in an actual prison. Prison life in 2020 was made that much harder by the pandemic, with bagged meals being brought to inmate cells. Today, in the post-lockdown era, most things have returned to normal, including prison meals and their menus. In every prison in the U.S., inmates are served the standard 3 meals.
Second breakfast, lunch,
and first dinner.
For breakfast, a pastry such as a Danish, some sort of cereal, either hot or cold, and a cold glass of milk because everyone needs their daily dose of calcium, right? For lunch and dinner, it could be chicken, hamburgers, fish cakes, tacos, and even burritos and lasagna. Relatively speaking, prisoners eat better today than ever. Of course, the exception would have to be the lucky inmates who found themselves behind bars in Alcatraz. Some folks have all the luck. And while prison life over in the UK is pretty much the same as it is in North America these days, the same can't be said about the food. It's not out of the ordinary to see prisoners enjoying pizza, porridge, bread, vegetable pasta bake, beans, and even breaded fish. However, some of these items are nothing like what you would find in a restaurant and definitely not like Mom or Mum used to make.
Mom! Mom! Mummy!
In most cases, the food dished out in UK prisons is high-carb, low-taste, and of questionable nutritional value. As far as dietary restrictions and requirements, the UK prison system does accommodate those inmates that require special dishes for both health or religious reasons.
We like fine dining, don't they realize we're savages?
We're serving up more great videos. All you need to do is just tap or click, so keep watching. Thanks.